Acid Country. The Secret History of LSD in the American Southwest, from Desert Laboratories to Phase 3. The standard American history of LSD has been told so many times that it has acquired the smoothness of folklore. Albert Hoffman rides his bicycle home from the Sandoz laboratory in Basel. The CIA pours acid into the strange subterranean machinery of MKUltra. Timothy Leary discovers the gospel according to psilocybin at Harvard. Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters paint a bus. Owsley Stanley makes extraordinarily pure LSD in California and becomes inseparable from the mythology of the Grateful Dead. San Francisco blooms, Nixon retaliates, the laboratories disappear, and the psychedelic age supposedly ends sometime around Altamont. It is an excellent story. It is also no longer the most interesting one. Another history runs south and east from California, across the deserts, mountains and high plateaus of Nevada, Colorado and New Mexico, sometimes spilling onto the Great Plains. It is a history of chemists who worked far from Haight Street, of laboratories assembled in rented houses and dismantled into trailers. Of an underground research culture whose practitioners thought of themselves less as drug dealers than as experimental pharmacologists, of missile silos, desert workshops and eccentric private institutes. Of government informants who were simultaneously evangelists for the substances they helped suppress. Its characters include Leonard Picard, Clyde Apperson, Gordon Todd Skinner, Casey Hardison, Darrell Lemaire and, later, Hamilton Morris, who became one of the most persistent chroniclers of the place where clandestine chemistry meets legitimate pharmacology. And unlike the familiar LSD story, this one does not end. It changes clothes. By 2026, LSD remains a Schedule I controlled substance under federal law. Yet a pharmaceutical company is simultaneously running Phase 3 trials of a proprietary formulation of lysergide, LSD, for major depression and generalized anxiety disorder. In August, Definium Therapeutics announced that a single-dose Phase 3 study involving 214 patients had met its primary endpoint for generalized anxiety disorder. Earlier in the summer it reported another positive late-stage result in major depressive disorder. The FDA has now issued final guidance specifically explaining how psychedelic drugs should be investigated as medicines. The Department of Veterans Affairs is running psychedelic clinical trials. Eli Lilly has agreed to spend as much as $3.8 billion acquiring a company developing 5-MeO-DMT, DMT and an MDMA-related pipeline. Otsuka has paid hundreds of millions for a company developing methadone for PTSD. AbbVie has acquired a next-generation psychedelic compound for depression. Then, on April 18, 2026, President Donald Trump signed Executive Order 14401 instructing the FDA, HHS, DEA and VA to accelerate psychedelic research, facilitate certain investigational access, collaborate with private industry, and prepare for rapid consideration of rescheduling specific psychedelic products that successfully complete Phase 3 trials and win FDA approval. At the signing ceremony, discussing ibogaine, Trump jokingly asked, "Can I have some, please?" and added that he would take whatever it took because he did not have time to be depressed. One could hardly invent a more improbable epilogue to the American drug war. But it may be better understood as another chapter in the same story. The other acid geography. California deserves its place in psychedelic history, but geography shaped the next generation differently. By the 1980s and 1990s, the conditions that had made psychedelic chemistry conspicuous on the West Coast, countercultural communities, law enforcement attention, legendary personalities, and a mythology that practically advertised itself, also made less obvious locations attractive. The American interior offered another kind of landscape. Enormous distances, cheap or unusual properties, sparsely populated districts, eccentric communities. And a long Western tradition of people who went somewhere remote precisely because they did not wish to be observed too closely. The best documented example is the organization surrounding Leonard Picard and Clyde Apperson. According to the federal court record, the two established an LSD laboratory in an Aspen, Colorado, residence in late 1996. Apperson handled much of the physical establishment and dismantling of the laboratory, while Picard served as its principal chemist. In September 1997, the operation moved to a house in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where the government alleged that LSD was produced until September 1999. The laboratory was then disassembled, stored and ultimately moved east to a decommissioned missile facility in Kansas. That itinerary matters more than the sensational quantities later attached to it. Aspen to Santa Fe to an abandoned Cold War installation is almost a map of late 20th century alternative America: resort wealth, southwestern mysticism, abandoned military infrastructure. It illustrates something important about sophisticated clandestine production. The laboratory need not have a permanent address. Expertise was portable. Equipment was portable. Capital was portable. The operation existed primarily as a network of people and knowledge. The building was merely wherever those things happened to be assembled at the time. The Santa Fe episode is particularly significant because it places one of the best documented large LSD operations squarely within the cultural geography of northern New Mexico. The court record describes a laboratory operating there for roughly 2 years. Picard himself was no stereotypical basement cook. He had studied at major universities and had been exposed to legitimate psychedelic pharmacology at Purdue, where David E. Nichols became one of the most important academic researchers in the field. That porous boundary between authorized and unauthorized knowledge is essential to the story. Psychedelic chemistry never divided neatly into one group of brilliant scientists wearing university identification cards and another group of ignorant criminals hiding in garages. Knowledge crossed the line even when people did not. The government's case, however, should not be allowed to harden into mythology merely because it produced convictions. Gordon Todd Skinner, a central figure in the story, was also a government informant, and recollections surrounding the operation have often been contradictory. Hamilton Morris would later open his extraordinary account of the Wamego missile silo by observing that the story consisted of truths, partial truths and outright lies that were extremely difficult to separate. Vice repeated the famous claim that the organization may at one point have supplied an enormous percentage of the LSD in circulation, but Morris carefully attributed that estimate rather than presenting it as independently established fact. That distinction is worth preserving. The scale was clearly substantial. The folklore surrounding it is another matter. The missile silo that ate the story. The missile silo eventually overwhelmed nearly everything else in the popular memory of the Picard affair. It was irresistible. LSD manufactured in a former nuclear installation, the Cold War literally transformed into a psychedelic laboratory. The image was too perfect. Reality was more complicated. Federal findings show a mobile operation that existed before the Kansas facilities and had already functioned in Colorado and New Mexico. The court record places LSD production for an extended period in Santa Fe and then for a shorter period at a missile facility near Ellsworth, Kansas. Later movements involved another installation associated with Skinner near Wamego. Skinner had purchased a decommissioned Atlas E complex and converted the underground space into what Morris later called a subterranean LSD palace. By the time Morris visited with Crystal Cole for Vice in 2011, the place had become a ruined monument to a very peculiar American moment: Cold War architecture repurposed first as private psychedelic utopia, then as crime scene, then as legend. Cole's testimony in the Vice documentary is valuable precisely because it destroys the temptation to romanticize the underground. The environment she describes contained extraordinary intellectual curiosity and an almost monastic fascination with psychoactive compounds, but it also contained deception, coercion, paranoia, reckless human experimentation and eventually serious violence. Skinner's identity as chemist, financier, psychedelic evangelist and informant seems to shift depending upon who is telling the story. Morris himself questioned the extent of Skinner's chemical abilities. This is one reason the Southwestern history is more revealing than another celebratory account of psychedelic outlaws. It exposes a contradiction that runs through the entire subject. A person may sincerely believe psychedelic compounds possess enormous value for humanity and still behave disastrously. Intellectual seriousness does not confer moral seriousness. Knowledge of pharmacology does not necessarily produce ethics. That contradiction would later haunt the institutional psychedelic renaissance as well. The Lazy Lizard and the Invisible College. 5 years after getting high on crystal, Hamilton Morris returned to the American desert for an episode of Hamilton's pharmacopoeia called The Lazy Lizard School of Hedonism. Vice described the episode simply: Morris meets LSD chemist Casey Hardison in the Nevada desert and travels with him to visit Daryl Lemaire, whom the program calls an unsung hero of psychedelic history. The episode is important because it depicts something that conventional histories of drugs often miss: the existence of an informal intellectual lineage among clandestine chemists. The people in that lineage did not necessarily think of themselves as manufacturers of a consumer intoxicant. Some understood their work as chemistry, pharmacology and consciousness research performed outside institutions whose legal restrictions they regarded as irrational. That did not make their activity legal, nor did it erase the considerable risks created when experimental psychoactive substances escaped ordinary systems of toxicology and quality control. But it explains why underground psychedelic culture repeatedly generated figures with surprisingly sophisticated chemical knowledge. Daryl Lemaire is almost archetypal. The desert facility Morris visited was not portrayed as a conventional trafficking operation. It was an eccentric private research world associated with investigations of psychoactive compounds and unusual synthetic methods. Recent online circulation has revived a segment under the title, Synthesizing LSD at Room Temperature Using PYBOP, which is almost certainly the source of the PyBob name you remembered. PYBOP is the name of a laboratory coupling reagent, not a psychedelic and not a person. The significance for our purposes is not the procedure itself, which need not be reproduced, but what the segment reveals culturally. Clandestine LSD chemistry had continued to evolve chemically long after the popular imagination had frozen it in the technology of the 1960s. That may be the deepest lesson of Morris's reporting. Prohibition did not stop psychedelic research. It fragmented it. Some research migrated into universities under Schedule I licenses. Some survived in clandestine laboratories. Some moved to Europe. Some became research chemical commerce operating within contested or temporary legal gray zones. Some discoveries passed through private correspondence and informal communities before eventually resurfacing in legitimate papers. Researchers such as David Nichols maintained rigorous academic programs while underground chemists read the same scientific literature for entirely different purposes. The communities were not identical, but they inhabited the same intellectual universe. The federal analog doctrine made the supposed loophole surrounding novel substances far less straightforward than internet folklore suggested. DEA guidance notes that a substance intended for human consumption can under certain circumstances be treated as Schedule I when it is substantially similar in structure or pharmacological effect to a Schedule I or II drug, even when the exact molecule does not appear by name on the schedules. Structural novelty, in other words, never automatically meant legal safety. Yet the proliferation of lysergamides and other psychedelic analogs created something scientifically important. Chemists were no longer asking only what LSD does. They were asking which pieces of the molecule produce which biological effects, how small structural changes alter potency and duration, and whether the therapeutic properties attributed to psychedelics can be separated from, or at least modified independently of, the hallucinatory experience. That question eventually escaped the underground entirely. From PYBOP to ultra-LSD. The final episode of Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia, broadcast in February 2021, was titled, Ultra-LSD. Anyone encountering the title casually might assume that it concerned a new, unusually powerful form of acid. Instead, Morris used LSD as the doorway into a much stranger transformation. The ultra referred in important part to ultra-large-scale molecular docking, computational screening of immense libraries of theoretical molecules against the serotonin 5-HT2A receptor, the principal receptor associated with the classic psychedelic effects of LSD and related compounds. The episode connected figures including David Nichols and pharmacologist Brian Roth with the emerging ability to examine psychedelic pharmacology at molecular and computational resolution. This was the moment when the secret history ceased to be principally about who could manufacture LSD and became a question of who could redesign what LSD means. Scientists had already reached an important milestone in 2017 with publication of the crystal structure of LSD bound to a human serotonin receptor. Structural biology was beginning to show, literally at the molecular level, how LSD interacted with its target. Subsequent 5-HT2A structures and signaling studies made possible increasingly rational attempts to design compounds rather than merely discover them. This represents a profound change in the economics of psychedelic chemistry. The clandestine chemist's competitive advantage was synthetic expertise, the ability to transform difficult precursors into a potent molecule while remaining outside the gaze of law enforcement. The 21st century pharmaceutical chemist can possess something different: receptor structures, machine learning, enormous virtual libraries, automated assays, and intellectual property portfolios. Instead of asking how to make kilograms of an existing psychedelic, contemporary research asks which of billions of hypothetical molecules might interact with a receptor in a desirable way. The laboratory, in a sense, has partly become computational. And the objective has changed with it. A 2023 Science paper reported evidence that psychedelic-induced neuroplasticity involves intracellular 5-HT2A receptors, helping sharpen the biological debate about how these drugs might produce durable changes. In 2025, researchers reported in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences the design of an LSD analog, JRT, intended to retain potentially useful pharmacological characteristics while reducing hallucinogenic potential. These are early research findings rather than established human therapies, but they illustrate the trajectory unmistakably. LSD is becoming not simply a drug but a molecular scaffold from which a new pharmacology may be engineered. Here the underground and pharmaceutical worlds almost invert one another. The clandestine tradition prized the psychedelic effect. Pharmaceutical development may regard that same effect as an expensive logistical burden. A 12-hour transformative experience sounds appealing in countercultural literature. To a hospital administrator or insurance company, it can mean a monitored room, trained personnel, screening, liability exposure, and most of a working day. Shorter-acting molecules, more predictable formulations, easier delivery systems, and compounds with attenuated subjective effects therefore possess obvious commercial attractions. The trip itself has become a development variable. Burning Man. Market, myth, and meeting place. It is tempting to draw a straight line from Southwestern Laboratories to Burning Man and announce that the Black Rock Desert became the modern distribution center of acid culture. That would make excellent mythology. The evidence does not justify saying it. Psychedelic use is unquestionably embedded in parts of Burning Man culture. There is even contemporary academic ethnography specifically examining spiritual psychedelic use among participants at the event. Organizations concerned with psychedelic harm reduction and peer support have also become part of the larger festival ecosystem. But cultural prevalence is not the same thing as a documented supply chain. Without court records, first-person sourcing evidence, or other strong documentation, claims that a particular contemporary laboratory supplies Burning Man remain claims. Any serious secret history must know the difference between secrets and rumors. Burning Man is nevertheless important for another reason. It became one of the places where psychedelic counterculture ceased to be culturally separate from the technological and financial elite. The Black Rock Desert brought together artists, programmers, entrepreneurs, alternative health advocates, wealthy investors, and long-standing psychedelic activists. In the larger history of the psychedelic renaissance, that convergence matters enormously. The decisive transfer was not necessarily a package of blotter changing hands on the playa. It was social capital. Psychedelic-centered networks populated by people who knew how to start companies, finance clinical trials, build biotechnology firms, and make introductions to billionaires. What had once been an underground social world increasingly overlapped with venture capital, Silicon Valley, and institutional medicine. In this sense, Burning Man may have mattered more as a cultural switchyard than as a drug market. That transformation also explains why the psychedelic renaissance of the 2020s looks so unlike its 1960s predecessor. The new missionary does not necessarily wear tie-dye. He may carry a term sheet. Acid, Incorporated. The most startling evidence for the institutionalization of psychedelic chemistry is sitting in ordinary pharmaceutical filings. Definium Therapeutics, formerly MindMed, is developing DT-120, a proprietary orally disintegrating formulation of lysergide tartrate, LSD. Its own regulatory filings describe an intellectual property strategy covering formulation and methods of use, and its Phase 3 program encompasses generalized anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder, and a planned PTSD program. In June 2026, the company reported a positive Phase 3 result for major depression. On August 12, it announced results from the 214-person Voyage study in generalized anxiety disorder. According to the company's top-line data, participants receiving the active treatment showed a placebo-adjusted 5.4-point improvement on the Hamilton Anxiety Rating Scale at 12 weeks, with effects appearing rapidly after dosing. Reuters independently reported the top-line result while emphasizing that this remains an experimental product awaiting further study and regulatory review. This deserves a moment of contemplation. The molecule whose manufacture once helped send Leonard Picard to federal prison for life is now the active pharmaceutical basis of a Phase 3 psychiatric program. Federal law has not caught up with that cultural transformation. LSD remains explicitly listed in Schedule 1 under 21 CFR 1308.11. It has not become generally legal because a pharmaceutical company is studying it, nor because the FDA regards psychedelic drug development as legitimate. Schedule 1 research occurs within a controlled regulatory framework. The apparent contradiction is therefore real but legally comprehensible. A substance may remain prohibited for ordinary possession while simultaneously undergoing FDA-authorized clinical development. If a specific product eventually receives approval, the controlled substance scheduling applicable to that product can then change. Trump's 2026 executive order makes that possible transition unusually explicit. It directs the Attorney General, in consultation with HHS, to initiate and complete review of products containing Schedule 1 substances that successfully complete Phase 3 trials for serious mental illness, so that product-specific rescheduling can proceed rapidly when appropriate after FDA approval. This is not psychedelic legalization. It is potentially something stranger: pharmaceutical legalization without cultural legalization. The outlaw molecule may become a prescription product while remaining illegal in essentially every other context. How pharma cuts in. The phrase, "Big Pharma is trying to cut in on the action," is rhetorically satisfying, but the reality is more interesting than simple appropriation. Pharmaceutical companies cannot profit merely by rediscovering that psilocybin mushrooms, LSD or DMT exist. They need defensible products, proprietary formulations, novel molecules, delivery systems, manufacturing processes, clinical datasets, regulatory exclusivity and patents covering some combination of composition and use. They also need products capable of fitting into healthcare systems whose economics are fundamentally different from those of psychedelic culture. That pressure explains much of contemporary psychedelic drug design. AbbVie completed its acquisition in October 2025 of bretisilocin, a short-acting investigational serotonergic psychedelic developed by Gilgamesh Pharmaceuticals for major depressive disorder. AbbVie explicitly describes the molecule's shorter psychoactive duration as a development advantage over longer-acting psychedelic compounds. Otsuka went further in June 2026, completing its acquisition of Transcend Therapeutics. Otsuka paid $700 million upfront with as much as $525 million in additional contingent consideration. Transcend's lead candidate, methylone-based TSND-201, is in Phase 3 development for PTSD and has received FDA Breakthrough Therapy designation. Then came Eli Lilly. On July 16, 2026, Lilly announced an agreement to acquire Atai-Beckley in a transaction potentially worth roughly $3.8 billion. The portfolio includes BPL-003, a synthetic form of 5-MeO-DMT in Phase 3 development for treatment-resistant depression, VLS-01, a DMT formulation in Phase 2, and an rMDMA program for social anxiety disorder. This is no longer speculative psychedelic capitalism living on PowerPoint presentations and promises of a renaissance. One of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies is offering billions of dollars for a psychedelic development platform. The pharmaceutical entry also clarifies something that idealistic accounts of the psychedelic renaissance sometimes obscure. A successful drug must become administratively manageable. If treatment requires 8 or 12 hours of supervision, specially trained therapists, elaborate rooms and extensive preparation, the molecule may work while the business model fails. This is why companies are intensely interested in shorter experiences, altered delivery systems and non-hallucinogenic, or less hallucinogenic neuroplastogens. The pharmacological question, must one trip to heal, has become inseparable from the economic question, must an insurer pay 2 professionals to sit with someone all afternoon? The answer will shape the next generation of drugs. The FDA learns to speak psychedelic. Government regulation has undergone an equally striking evolution. In July 2026, the FDA issued final industry guidance entitled Psychedelic Drugs, Considerations for Clinical Investigations. The existence of that document is itself historically remarkable. The agency is no longer debating whether psychedelic therapeutics are serious enough to warrant a regulatory framework, it is specifying how companies should study them. This does not mean regulators have surrendered to psychedelic enthusiasm. Quite the opposite. Psychedelic trials present unusual scientific problems. The most obvious is blinding. Someone given a conventional placebo generally does not spend hours undergoing unmistakable alterations of perception, emotion and selfhood. Participants can often guess whether they received the active drug, and therapists may guess as well. Expectations can therefore contaminate results. The MDMA controversy showed how consequential such problems can become. In June 2024, an FDA advisory committee considered Lykos Therapeutics' application for MDMA-assisted treatment of PTSD and voted overwhelmingly against, concluding that the submitted evidence established an acceptable benefit-risk profile. Concerns included functional unblinding, study design, safety monitoring and research conduct. The FDA subsequently declined to approve the application in its existing form. That episode should be remembered whenever psychedelic therapeutics are described as an inevitable revolution. Promising results are not approval. Breakthrough therapy designation is not approval. A Phase 3 press release is not peer review. And a moving testimonial from someone whose life improved after psychedelic treatment cannot establish population-level efficacy or safety. The field has matured partly because it has begun encountering the same unforgiving standards as every other branch of pharmaceutical medicine. That is healthy. Veterans rewrite the politics. If Silicon Valley supplied money and biotech supplied a commercial mechanism, American veterans supplied psychedelic medicine with something else, political legitimacy in places where the old counterculture could never have obtained it. Post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injury, addiction, depression and suicide have made psychedelic experimentation a practical rather than ideological question for some veterans and their families. The political result has been extraordinary. Psychedelic reform now attracts advocates from constituencies that would once have been expected to support the drug war. The Department of Veterans Affairs announced in December 2024 that it would fund its first psychedelic-assisted therapy study since the 1960s, examining MDMA-assisted therapy for veterans with both PTSD and alcohol use disorder. In May 2026, the VA announced another MDMA-assisted mental health trial. Then, on August 5, it announced a randomized controlled psilocybin trial for veterans with treatment-resistant major depression, including patients with concurrent PTSD, across 5 VA sites. The VA's own educational material is notably cautious. It acknowledges the promise of MDMA and psilocybin while emphasizing that these substances remain investigational and that psychedelic research contains unresolved methodological and implementation problems. That distinction matters particularly with ibogaine, the substance that has captured so much of the new political imagination. Reports from some veterans and people treated for substance dependence have been extraordinary, but ibogaine is pharmacologically different from LSD or psilocybin and carries serious cardiac risks. The Associated Press and Reuters have both emphasized the gap between enthusiastic testimony and the still limited evidence base, including long-standing concerns about potentially dangerous heart rhythm effects. Yet ibogaine accomplished politically what LSD never could in the Nixon era. It became associated publicly not with rebellion against American institutions but with damaged combat veterans seeking treatment after conventional medicine had failed them. That changed the moral vocabulary of the issue. Donald Trump, Joe Rogan and the psychedelic White House. Nothing demonstrates that reversal better than April 18, 2026. Trump's Executive Order 14401 declared that psychedelic drugs, including ibogaine compounds, showed potential for people whose serious mental illnesses had not responded adequately to existing treatment. It ordered federal agencies to prioritize qualifying psychedelic drugs in the FDA voucher system, establish mechanisms for eligible right-to-try access consistent with controlled substance law, direct at least $50 million through ARPA-H toward federal-state psychedelic research collaboration, increase cooperation with the VA and private sector, and prepare mechanisms for timely product-specific rescheduling after successful Phase 3 development and FDA approval. Whatever one's politics, this represents a genuine historical discontinuity. The federal government that spent decades treating psychedelics largely as objects of prohibition is now being instructed by a Republican president to help accelerate their investigation as medicines. Joe Rogan was present at the White House event, and reporting described his advocacy, particularly around ibogaine and veterans, as part of the rapid political chain that helped move the issue onto Trump's agenda. Trump then produced the line that would have been unimaginable from almost any 20th-century president. After hearing about ibogaine's alleged benefits, he joked, "Can I have some, please?" The joke should not obscure the policy. 3 days later, Reuters reported on the administration's broader psychedelic initiative, and by April 24 the FDA had moved to use priority review mechanisms for qualifying psychedelic candidates. Psychedelic biotechnology stocks reacted accordingly. The drug war had not ended. The financial market had simply noticed that the federal government might be preparing an exit ramp for particular pharmaceutical psychedelics. The Great Conversion. Here, finally, the clandestine Southwest and contemporary pharmaceutical America come back together. Consider the sequence. In the 1990s, an LSD chemist operating in Colorado and New Mexico had to conceal the laboratory itself. The equipment moved. Identities were disguised. Knowledge was dangerous because possession of the knowledge in conjunction with an operating laboratory could help establish a criminal enterprise. When the network collapsed, members faced sentences measured in decades and lifetimes. A generation later, researchers publish receptor structures describing exactly how LSD binds to human serotonin receptors. Supercomputers screen enormous chemical spaces for molecules that might improve on psychedelic scaffolds. Medicinal chemists deliberately alter LSD-like compounds in an attempt to separate therapeutic effects from hallucination. Then a biotechnology company puts LSD into Phase 3. Then the FDA writes psychedelic-specific clinical guidance. Then major pharmaceutical companies begin acquiring psychedelic pipelines for hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. Then the Department of Veterans Affairs begins enrolling veterans into psychedelic trials. Then a president orders the government to accelerate the entire process. The molecule did not change nearly as much as the institutions surrounding it did. This is perhaps the true secret history. What the underground actually contributed. The temptation is to resolve the story morally. One version says that courageous underground chemists preserved valuable medicines while a reactionary state persecuted them, only for corporations to steal their discoveries once profits became available. Another says that reckless criminals produced dangerous illegal drugs until responsible scientists finally rescued useful compounds from counterculture. Neither version survives close examination. The underground preserved knowledge, experimented with molecules and maintained cultural interest during decades when conventional institutions often treated psychedelic research as professionally radioactive. It also generated bad chemistry, uncertain dosing, dangerous experimentation, criminal violence and extravagant mythology. Some clandestine chemists were intellectually serious. Some were charlatans. Some were both. Institutional medicine brings controlled manufacturing, toxicology, structured trials, adverse event monitoring and the possibility of treating millions of patients through ordinary health systems. It also brings patents, exclusivity, investor expectations, pricing strategies and a tendency to treat experiences and molecules used outside corporate medicine as raw material awaiting ownership. Both worlds contain idealists. Both contain opportunists. The important historical fact is that they are not separate worlds anymore. The problem of the trip. One unresolved issue may decide whether psychedelic medicine becomes a genuinely new therapeutic paradigm or merely another class of psychiatric pharmaceuticals. What is the treatment? Is it principally the molecule? Is it the subjective psychedelic experience? Is it neuroplasticity occurring during a temporary biological window? Is it psychotherapy facilitated by altered consciousness? Or is it some combination whose parts cannot easily be separated? The answer has enormous commercial consequences. Traditional psychedelic-assisted therapy assumes that preparation, setting, psychological support and integration matter profoundly. Yet the pharmaceutical industry has obvious incentives to minimize the expensive human infrastructure surrounding treatment. Definium's LSD program is especially interesting because it is being developed as a standardized pharmaceutical intervention rather than simply reproducing the classic psychedelic therapy model. Its pivotal trials use supervised dosing and elaborate controls, but the commercial proposition ultimately depends upon turning LSD into something medicine can deliver reproducibly. Meanwhile, researchers developing compounds such as the reduced hallucinogenic LSD analog reported in 2025 are exploring an even more radical possibility. Perhaps some therapeutic neurobiological effects can be preserved while much of the trip is removed. If that works in humans, and that remains a very large if, the result would be philosophically comic. The pharmaceutical industry may spend billions of dollars attempting to engineer the psychedelia out of psychedelics. The underground chemists might reasonably wonder what the point was. The new secret laboratory. Perhaps, then, the modern secret history of LSD ends with the disappearance of the secret laboratory. Not because clandestine manufacture has disappeared. There is no reason to believe illicit production has vanished, and the continuing illicit market demonstrates otherwise. But clandestine manufacturing is no longer where the most consequential frontier necessarily lies. The new laboratory may occupy an entirely respectable building. Its chemists have badges. Its controlled substances sit inside audited storage. Its experimental protocols have institutional review board numbers. Its molecule may resemble LSD but possess a patent number and an internal development code. Its subjects sign informed consent documents. Its results go to statisticians. Its investors listen to quarterly earnings calls. Elsewhere, another laboratory exists only virtually, as billions of hypothetical compounds move through computational models of a serotonin receptor. And somewhere between them sits the strange cultural memory of the desert chemist, half outlaw, half amateur pharmacologist, working in a rented house. Converted military structure or improvised private institute because no respectable institution was willing to permit the investigation. Hamilton Morris's documentaries caught that world at precisely the moment it was disappearing into something larger. Getting High on Crystal looked backward into the ruins of the missile silo era. The Lazy Lizard School of Hedonism documented an aging clandestine intellectual tradition in the desert. Ultra LSD looked forward into structural biology and computation. Taken together, they form an accidental trilogy about the migration of psychedelic knowledge from outlaw chemistry into institutional science. The geographical setting is fitting. The American Southwest has always invited projection, emptiness mistaken for freedom, distance mistaken for secrecy, desert mistaken for blankness. In reality, the landscape is crowded with histories, indigenous, military, scientific, spiritual, criminal, technological. Psychedelic culture attached itself to all of them. The missile silo is an especially perfect symbol. It was built to contain one of the ultimate technologies of 20th century state power. Later, private citizens converted such structures into hideaways and psychedelic spaces. The architecture of annihilation became the architecture of altered consciousness. Now the transformation has happened again. The same federal state that imprisoned LSD chemists is contemplating pathways by which LSD-containing pharmaceutical products might be approved and rescheduled. The same American business culture that once regarded psychedelia as the emblem of social disorder is placing billion-dollar valuations on companies deriving medicines from psychedelic pharmacology. The same military community invoked for decades in support of the war on drugs has supplied some of the most politically persuasive advocates for psychedelic treatment. This does not mean the psychedelic revolution has won. It means the revolution has been acquired, regulated, randomized, blinded, patented and entered into phase 3. Whether that represents vindication, domestication or capture depends upon what happens next. The pivotal question is no longer whether LSD can survive prohibition. It plainly did. Nor is it whether psychedelics can attract respectable scientific attention. They already have. The question is what happens when an underground pharmacological tradition that developed partly in rebellion against institutional authority becomes an industry whose future depends upon precisely those institutions: the FDA, DEA, pharmaceutical corporations, insurance companies, hospitals, patent offices and investors. Leonard Picard's laboratory had to move from Colorado to New Mexico and ultimately into the strange security of obsolete Cold War infrastructure. The 21st century LSD laboratory does not need to hide. Its greatest accomplishment may be an FDA submission. Its most valuable product may not be the molecule but the intellectual property surrounding it. And the next great psychedelic empire may not be built in a missile silo, a Nevada desert compound or a warehouse bound for the playa. It may be built in a boardroom. That is the strangest turn in the secret history of acid. After 70 years of utopians, spies, chemists, informants, psychonauts, federal agents, therapists and outlaws fighting over what psychedelics were permitted to mean, the American establishment has begun to ask a very different question. Not whether these substances should exist, but who will own the medicine they become.